to it. So welcome everyone to this Career Journeys interview with Michael Hadley. Full disclosure, Michael is my son, and obviously I'm proud of the things that he's done and accomplished. So I thought it would be fun to interview him for the series. So of course, getting some people. So the point of this series is to basically explore people who have had interesting transitions and dig into what are some of the secrets of those transitions so that others can use that to help them navigate their own career journeys. So we will just jump into it. So Michael, in college, you did a lot of research under your advisor, who was then the new head of the new neuroscience department at Lafayette. So how did doing research throughout your college career, affect either your future directions or your thinking, or what came after that?
Yeah, I think I got really lucky having that professor, Elaine Reynolds, as my mentor for that research project, because she is very good at giving students agency early on in their careers in research. So I got to set some of the research direction and try to answer questions that there were no answers for yet. And that set me off on a path of research that I was really excited about. So I think it fundamentally changed what I was thinking about doing. Like when I joined undergrad, I thought I wanted to be pre-med and go be a doctor, and having a taste of research like immediately changed my career trajectory.
Now, as I recall, you also had an issue there with the trying to, thinking about that future direction as a doctor, or I think at one time you were thinking of a veterinarian, except that you had a little objection to the idea of dissecting animals in the process. How'd you deal with that one?
That one kind of aligned with my interests, where I didn't want to do wet lab work. I wanted to do computational research and think about ideas using simulation and computational modeling, mathematical modeling. So it just worked out that the things that I was interested in doing didn't involve doing dissections.
And didn't Elaine, I think she actually offered to set things up in a way that you could do virtual dissections if you really wanted to pursue that direction.
Yeah, and she's done more of that recently. There's a lot of like wet lab simulators where you can play with neurons that I think she still uses in her classes, but she also had a policy of letting students opt out and just observe.
Now, even though you're no longer pursuing neuroscience, I mean, you've maintained a very close relationship with Elaine over the years. And I know, many of us had professors who were important to us. We had a relationship for some time, but most of the time that kind of ended soon after graduation. So what do you think led to such a long relationship with Elaine, and how has that affected you? What has that relationship meant in your career, in your life?
Yeah, I think I've been lucky to have a very small number of mentors who turned into lifelong friends. I think Elaine is one of the most influential mentors I've had. She cares a lot about her students and giving them that agency so that they're empowered in the future, whatever their career may be. So she would take us, the group of us that was working on the research project, to go present at the big Society for Neuroscience conference kind of outside of the class context. And those experiences were eye-opening, but also really exciting to be able to have those moments. So I'm very grateful for her mentorship in undergrad, but then we kept collaborating as my career shifts happened. So when I started getting interested in art, she also was interested in art. So we would work on art projects together, and that relationship went from mentorship to friends over time.
Now, you said something about having a small number of mentors who were important, who turned into lifelong friends. And I think actually that small number is a good thing. I don't think a lot of us ever have more than one or two mentors. I still have a former boss one of my very early bosses, who I still consider a mentor, even though he's retired, but doing some very interesting things in his retirement. But I think, what do you think just having a mentor, even, how important do you think that is?
I think it's been a fundamental piece of every career shift that I've had, is that I have people that have more experience that I can go talk to about the shift that I'm thinking, get their perspective and read on it. With also having the context that they know me very well. So they know my past transitions, and they can usually give me good advice. So it was crucial, fundamental to those shifts.
Yeah, in fact, that's often when I'm working with job seekers, that's often one of the things I promote, is talk to people who knew you well, or who you worked with, or mentors, and just get their perspective on things. And it gets you out of your own head, and you hear what others have to say. Sometimes that's just kind of almost a self-affirmation, that if I'm starting to feel down about my directions or what's going on, and someone else tells me about some of the things that we did together that were meaningful to them, it's kind of self-affirming. So, and by the way, for everyone on the call, feel free to, I have put you all on mute just to keep the line clean for the recording, but feel free to jump in at any time if you would like to ask a question. If something in our discussion strikes you that you just want to, comment on that, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in at that point. So now, we get out of college and you've been studying neuroscience, but you were working really hard. I mean, I remember you talked about the research that you were doing, and I remember, you did a master, not a master's, they had a honors program where you had to do a thesis, and I remember talking to your advisors at the end of that, and we're just chatting about how how you did, how this went, and they were commenting that you really, what they felt you did was really more of a master's thesis, that you set out to do something and they took bets on how far you would get. They said, yeah, there's no way he can do this. So how far do we feel he needs to go for us to actually give him the honors? And then they said, and darned if he didn't actually do what we didn't think he could set out to do. So you'd had this really intense year, and then you took a gap year while you were figuring things out. So tell us a little bit about that gap year, what you did and how that affected things going forward from there.
I think the motivation at that point was that I was so deep in things, trying to wrap up my thesis and classwork and everything else, that I didn't really feel like I had a moment to consider the next step properly. It seemed logical to go to grad school and continue doing research, but just the pace of things made it feel like I really want a moment to reflect on this and think whether this is actually what I want as the next thing, or if it's just momentum that's carrying me through to the next thing. So took that gap year and did a couple of things, but the main one was I continued my research. So then published a paper, which helped me solidify my resume for applying to grad school, and also helped solidify my interest. Like, oh, actually, I do enjoy this now that I'm doing it of my own agency and not doing it just because I need marks in school. So it gave me that moment to reflect and decide on what I wanted to do next.
I think that's a really powerful point, that that the idea of getting a chance to think about things and not just be moving forward in a direction because that's your momentum. And we all get wrapped up in that. You're so caught up in the day-to-day that you don't always take the time to reflect. Now, you also did something else interesting. I think one of your partners in that venture just joined us, Ray. So why don't you tell us about the other thing you did during that year?
Yeah, Ray and another friend of ours, Sean, and we got into making video games together, which kind of seeded my path for eventually getting into art. But yeah, we spent a lot of time hacking together at coffee shops and programming and learning about games and art during that gap year.
Now, if anyone's interested in checking out, is Convergence still available? I see Congregate kind of went in a new direction, so I couldn't seem to find it the last time I looked.
I don't know. I have not looked in a long time.
Okay. So okay, so now you have this gap, you kind of you've gotten a chance to reflect, you decide to go to graduate school, and so you go off to Berkeley, which was endlessly amusing to us because you didn't want to consider any large school, any school near a large metropolitan area for college. And then suddenly you go off to Berkeley, one of the biggest places in effect a big city. But anyway, so you go off to Berkeley to pursue this PhD in neuroscience. So what were you hoping to do with that? And what did you learn from pursuing that?
Yeah, I was hoping to continue the work that I was doing in undergrad of trying to model brain systems using code and simulation, and learn about them through recreating them and then doing digital experiments on them. I learned a lot. Part of the experience of joining that program, you have to rotate through a number of labs to find a lab that will take you. So I ended up doing research that was not what I expected for some of them, like doing studies on how people perceive and process 3D films, where we're like strapping people with eye trackers and then watching what they look at for a 3D film versus a 2D film. So I think there was a broadening of my experience by going there. But the most important thing that I learned there was that I didn't want to have a PhD and work in academia. Getting a taste of it and being really deep in it made me realize I wanted to go do other things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now you decide to pursue this master's in fine arts. So why that direction? What drove that? Particularly since, as I recall, you didn't have really any academic background in art. You didn't really take, other than I think you took like a drawing class on your own while you were in the PhD program, but you didn't have really any art background.
Yeah, I think the piece that was missing that I discovered at that point was that you could make art with code, that there's a whole field of art and technology. which I didn't know about prior to that. And the drawing classes helped step me into that world. Also, the video game work helped step me into that world. But as soon as I realized that I could take the things that I was using in my computational neuroscience work and plug it into something creative, that was the connective tissue that I needed to go off in a new direction.
So now that, the Art Institute of Chicago is a pretty well-known art school and pretty competitive program. Now, they only take a handful of master's students a year. So why do you think they chose you, given that, I mean, yes, you had some technology things you could apply, but you didn't have the art. What do you think led them to say, yeah, Michael's a good candidate for this?
Yeah, there are probably a few pieces. The art, the video games that I had made were a piece of my resume at that point, and like the only art that I had to show. But I also got lucky in that my mentor in that program, who was reviewing my application, was a computational neuroscientist before he turned into an artist. So there was a little bit of resonance there, in that he knew that that transition was possible and saw in me some of those kernels that he had. So I think I got lucky.
And what did you take away from the program, from your experience there?
It was definitely overwhelming to step into art without having had any training. The way that they approach problems and think about things was very different than how I did coming from neuroscience. But I think so some of how I thought about it was that, like, the science training, it was really good at taking a question and then trying to come up with an answer to it. And the art training was more about the question asking than the answering, and coming up with like, what is an interesting question to even ask. So they were complementary skill sets. It was like a really fire hose kind of transition to move into that space, but very rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
John, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Mike, how long was your transition mentally from not wanting to continue with your PhD to applying for art school?
I think by the end of the first year in my program, in the PhD program, I had decided that I wasn't really enjoying it and wanted to plan a way out. And then it took me another year to apply and line everything up and wrap up my master's in my program.
Mike, I'm just curious. You mentioned that, you were enjoying your research originally, and then when you got into it, you said, this is not for me. Could you tell us exactly what you liked about your research and what you discovered that turned you off? In other words, what were the attributes that attracted you, and what were the additional attributes that turned you away?
Yeah, I think in undergrad, I was working with some of my best friends doing the research. So it was just fun, a fun community to be doing research in undergrad. And by the time I got to grad school, the domain had specialized to the point where it was really hard to talk about what I was working on with anyone else who wasn't also specialized in that domain. So I started to feel isolated doing that research, that it was, it felt interesting and worthwhile to do, but it didn't feel like something I could share with other people. And the art was much more appealing, and that I could work on things, but it would also be something that would connect me to other people.
Now, as I recall, wasn't there also an element that you had kind of a vision for the sorts of things that you thought would be really interesting to research, that you'd like to do, and it was a real uphill battle to get professors to agree to sponsor you to do that, because they felt like, yeah, that's interesting, but here's what you should be doing.
Yeah, I think there was a reality in grad school that each lab has its own funding secured for different projects and lines of research. And it's great if you want to hop on one of those lines of research, because then they can take you in your lab and your funding is guaranteed in the program. But as soon as you want to do something new, you either have to convince someone to take a risk, or you have to go find the grant money yourself to then the labs will take you. So it was just a little bit of friction. I thought I could come in and work on exactly what I wanted to work on in research, and having to pick from a small subset of existing projects, I just couldn't find anything that was resonating.
Isn't that
Mhm.
true in art also, that you're dependent upon people who support you?
That's true. Yeah. And part of the realization leaving art school was that is hard. That when you're in art school, there's a little bit of a bubble, like, oh yeah, you can work on whatever you want. But then the reality when you leave is like, oh no, you can't just work on whatever you want unless you can magically find funding to make that happen.
Right, you really have to go about it, if you want to be successful, you have to, in a lot of ways, go about it as a business. That I'm going to market this, I'm going to find a way I make it happen. Like our cousin Laura, that she really went about her art, that 9 to 5, she'd be in her studio creating the art. She'd go to all the art shows in the area, and she now makes a very good living as an artist, and she's very talented, but she really approached it very much as a business.
Yeah, I think there's another approach too that one of my advisors left me with when we're having one of our last meetings. Is I was asking him what to do next, and he said, well, now you just go couch surf, and you like live on nothing and try and make art and get residencies and get shows until you have enough of a name to like stand on your own. And that just seemed like a bait and switch when I left art school, was that was the advice that I was getting for how to make it in the world as an artist.
Now you have had a little bit of success in the art world, although I think you've decided that it's more of an interesting hobby than your career. But can you tell us a little bit about your artistic endeavors that you've engaged in?
Yeah, a lot of the recent stuff has been with one of my friends from art school, Jonathan Rockford, where we he's more on the like physical making side and I'm more on the digital making side, where we combine our skills to work on different projects. They often involve looking at some phenomenon or thing from a new lens, like looking at something microscopic, but blowing it up to a different scale, or looking at something that happens on a very small time scale or large time scale and kind of transforming it into something else. So we had a project at Penn State where we were doing a site-specific installation for them that was for one of their material research buildings, where we had a webcam that was recording the entryway of their building, the little garden space outside for the whole year. And then what was happening was on the facade of the building, on one of the windows, we were projecting this like crystalline structure that had little pieces of imagery from the whole year. So you'd end up with this like mosaic that has a little piece of winter over here, a little piece of summer over here, as it played out over time.
Mm-hmm. And you've also, I mean, not that you're looking to make a career of it, but you've actually, you've made a little bit of money from your art, gotten a couple of prizes, a couple of, that couple of grants. So might you talk about what you did after art school and how the art infused any of that?
Yeah, immediately after art school, or actually interleaving with art school, one of the jobs that I picked up while I was in art school was teaching. There was a program that I got connected with that was taking artists and putting them into different schools in Chicago. So I was paired with a high school and working with teachers to try and build some art thinking and different approaches into curriculum. So one of the examples was a biology teacher and I worked on making a card game that was kind of like apples to apples, Cards Against Humanity style, where you had little creatures like lions, tigers, flies, insects, whatever, in a deck, and you would battle out why they had an advantage in an apocalyptic situation. So it was all about teaching like survival of the fittest in that class, but like doing it through a different lens of having the students play a game to learn about it. So I started teaching while I was in art school, and then when I graduated, a friend in the program was working at a small startup that was teaching programming for it was a code boot camp, so to try and help people train up and get into the industry, and ended up teaching there as my immediate job, leaving grad school and being really interested actually in education as the next part of my career journey.
And that, so in fact, you were the, as I recall, in addition to teaching there at CodeAbode, you became the curriculum director as well. So what did you learn from doing that? You know, because you know, again, you didn't, other than learning on the job, you didn't train to be a teacher, you didn't train to design curriculum. So how did you do that? What did you learn from it?
I think I had really good mentors when I was doing that teaching program in grad school that helped me think about how to design curriculum, how to design units, how to think about teaching. And then it was a lot of learning on the job. I started out as a part-timer teaching 1 or 2 classes. And then in our meetings, I was very vocal and about my thoughts about the curriculum. And it just turned into them offering me a job as the curriculum director because they were just getting going and didn't have people. I think a lot of what I learned was just trial by fire. Having to teach so many hours a day, eventually started to learn what was working and what wasn't working.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a point you made there that, you know, that I think is really another really important point. This concept of when you show a lot of engagement, when you ask a lot of questions, that can lead to opportunities that people see that and they say, hey, well, here's someone engaged. Let's ask them to do more. Let's get them involved in this. I know that happened to me, you know, a couple of times where I joined this industry committee on management and personal development. And the first meeting, I'm making all these comments and suggestions. And by the end of the first meeting, the chair comes up and says, you look like you'd make a really good candidate to be one of our chairs. Wouldn't you like to be the second vice chair come our next meeting? So, but yeah, just showing that engagement is so important. Yeah, go ahead, Russ.
Yeah, Mike, I'm just curious. Very often the educational world is filled with, you know, credentialing and other things. Did you have a problem becoming a head of curriculum without appropriate, whatever they want for accreditation, you know, like having some type of coursework and other things? Or if you didn't, why'd you get away with it? I mean, how did that school, how did the requirements of that school jibe with, you know, my conception of the teaching world, which is, at least at the K through 12 level, very structured?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things there that played into it. One was that since it was a code boot camp, it didn't have credentialing in a traditional way for instructors. They were just looking for people who knew about the industry. And I'd done some freelancing, so that was part of, I had done programming curriculum or taught programming curriculum before, so that was part of my resume. But I also had a moment when they offered me the job where they were like, I don't see anything in your resume that would make me believe that you would do a good job here, but you're very vocal in our meetings about curriculum, and we think you would do a good job despite that. So we're just going to take a chance. And I got lucky in that way.
I think that that actually happens more often than we realize. That when it's different when you're trying to go in through the front door and apply for this role, this teaching role, or whatever it might be. But when it's kind of the back door that people get engaged with you and they say, "Wow, we see a lot here. We see something that could be useful." They try to find a way to make the fit, and so it can help you get past some of those things. I mean, that you had the same, in effect, the same experience getting into Columbia College, I would say, in your in your role there as an assistant professor.
Yeah, that was another one where I started part-time. It was the group that I had taught with when I was in grad school hired me again part-time later on to work on some different things. And then once I was working at Columbia and they wanted to keep me, they made an assistant professor role to get me full-time there.
Okay, so now, so you're at CodeAbode. You've got a full-time job. You're teaching, but it's a startup, and as often happens with startups, sometimes things blow up. In this case, I guess the owner was going through a divorce, and that kind of sapped his finances, and he changed directions. So you found yourself, back on the street. It's deciding to close up shop there. So how'd you go about seeking your next opportunity, figuring out even what you wanted that next opportunity to be?
Yeah, I remember that moment. We were all very shell-shocked when the director pulled us into his office to just say that we were closing. We didn't have a lot of warning. I really enjoyed teaching, but wanted to do some programming. It felt like the teaching, I was not doing very complex programming while I was teaching. You're like working on a lot of example code, and it's not maybe as creatively fulfilling as if you were building something more complex. And while I was teaching, one of my students had approached me about contracting for him. He had a startup idea that he wanted to build, and he was taking my class to build up some of his technical chops, and realized quickly in taking the class that he didn't have the technical chops and needed to go find someone. And at the time I had said, it's really intense with the teaching load. I don't really have capacity. But then when we shut down, I just went back to him and said, "Hey, I'm free if you want to pursue this." And he did still. So I spent a while freelancing, basically just on that project full time after CodeAbode closed down.
Now, didn't you had some other consulting contracts, as I recall? What other things? What sort of, was there a theme to your contracting? How'd you find those, other than this one that kind of fell into place really naturally? How'd you find the other ones?
Yeah, this was the main one. There was a lot of work to do on it at that time, but it led me to other opportunities once I had a foot in the door and could say I worked on this project. Then when I got connected to other people, I could show them that as my resume. It opened up doors for one of the other big jobs I had was building a game engine for this open source project. They needed some help. I had used their game engine when making games in the past, and just reached out when they said that they needed some help building some stuff. And sort of, there was a client at Columbia who also hired me for freelancing while I was part-time at Columbia. Just happened to be that they were in my network, they needed something, and I knew how to build it for them.
So now, you get to, well, I guess initially it wasn't actually Columbia, it was that you were part of that group, and I'm drawing a blank on the name now, but the design lab, whatever it's called, but you were a learning product developer. So tell us what does that mean? What sort of things did you do? How did that go?
Yeah, there was a lot of game making. So the group that hired me, Convergence, was working in the dean's office at Columbia. And they would partner with organizations that often needed some help building curriculum or teaching curriculum. And some of the projects I worked on were like pairing with the Economic Awareness Council here in Chicago to build curriculum that would teach kids how to manage credit before they had a credit card. So to be prepared for those kinds of big financial decisions, and how we approached it was building a game, a little simulator where you make some credit decisions and you get to see the outcomes, positive and negative, of your choices without having to feel the repercussions in real life. So it was stuff along those lines.
Now you mentioned before that the card game that you did with that high school. Now you also did something that I thought sounded pretty interesting with a card game in your work with the Convergence Lab. What was that one?
I actually made a number of card games over the time there, but one that I think you might be referencing was one we did with a client where they wanted to build games to help teachers design curriculum. So they had the UN Sustainable Development Goals that they wanted to help teachers connect to the classroom. So we made a card game out of it where you would draw from this deck that had these goals from the UN, draw from this other deck that had prompts, and you sort of put them together in like a Mad Libs way that it formed kind of a prompt for you to think about with your curriculum. So that just a general theme of using games to help people brainstorm.
So now what led to ultimately migrating from learning product developer to actually being part of the faculty at Columbia College?
Yeah, the part of it was being a part-timer there and trying to do freelancing on the side was not sustainable. And I told them it needs to become full-time in some form for me to stick around, and that lit a fire under them for finding a role. But it also meant leveraging some of my teaching background to add teaching to what I was doing at Columbia. So being a professor, taking on classes, moving into the interactive media department, and taking on some of those responsibilities in addition to the learning product development role.
So now, very quickly, you hit into the pandemic and needed to convert everything you were doing to remote and then hybrid. Tell us about that experience. What did you learn from that? What were some of the issues that you needed to deal with?
Yep, that was challenging. One of the things I learned very quickly was the aspect that I found rewarding about teaching was being in the classroom with my students and getting to see the light bulb go off when they connect ideas and make some code run for the first time. And teaching remotely really put a damper on that. I didn't get to see that in my students, and I was left with the parts of teaching that were the least fun, like grading and following up on attendance. So I just found all of that at Columbia to be draining, and that ended up prompting me for another career move to leave Columbia. Yeah.
So how did you, even though it wasn't as much fun, I mean, you did a lot to kind of revise the way you were teaching to accommodate this new environment. What sort of things did you do? How did you make that work?
Yeah, I flipped my classes where I would record the content ahead of time, post it for my students, and then class time was more about building and collaborating. because I don't need to lecture at them. Like they can go watch a video at 1.5 speed, or pause it and rewind when things are confusing, which worked out well for our curriculum in general. I think my videos are still part of our programming curriculum, and still get views. So there was something nice about being able to record some concepts once or twice and have this collection, the shared collection at Columbia, where we could refer our students back to it. And if you had multiple teachers recording, you'd be like, oh, well, you didn't understand my explanation. Go check out Janelle's explanation of this concept. She does it in a different way. It might make more sense. So there were some nice aspects of that.
Mm-hmm. So now I think Beth has joined us. She had asked I invited people to say, what questions might you have ahead of time. I think she had asked about public speaking. Since you kind of learned organically, because I wouldn't have said you did any prep in high school or to become a public speaker. What advice might you have for public speaking, or what thoughts do you have on that?
The prep that I remember being formative was in grad school for neuroscience. We had a class that was just about public speaking, and the structure was just that you had to give 2 presentations in the semester. And the whole semester, it was just people giving presentations. They would record it, and then they would make you watch it back with them, your presentation. And that was hard to watch back, to hear all of the pauses and to hear like the things that made sense and the things that didn't make sense when you're outside of your head seeing it through film. That was really eye-opening. I think that changed how I thought about preparing lectures and public speaking. I also don't like public speaking. It's just a thing that I've had to do because of it. It was the way to do teaching. It like enabled the other things that I was interested in. So maybe the advice is just to jump in and try it. And if you can get people who will give you feedback or record yourself doing it, those can be shortcuts to help.
Yeah, recording is so powerful. I mean, even though I really enjoy speaking to groups and I give lots of webinars and I feel like I do a good job, I get good feedback. When I look at the recordings often, I'm like, oh, really? Is that how I'm speaking? So, yeah, Ray seconded that. Okay, so now you decided to make another change. So how did you go about figuring out what that would be? How did that kind of merge together the different things that you had done or studied so far?
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to leave Columbia when the day-to-day just wasn't rewarding anymore and was more stressful than it was worth. And I was looking around trying to figure out the next thing, and education was really important to me. Being able to do something creative was important to me. And it just happened that one of the tools that I was using in the classroom had sent out a newsletter to say that they were hiring. So this was a tool that allowed me to really easily spin up programming environments for my students. So when I got that email, I started thinking like, oh, actually, I could go still do things that would be impactful in the education space, but go join industry and work at a startup that's in this space and have a different kind of impact. So if I can build tools that teachers are using in the classroom, I can have a bigger impact than I could if I'm just one person in the classroom with 15 students.
So now, as I recall, I mean, you had obviously you had a very non-traditional background, and you had a lot of concerns about will a place see what I bring to the table for software engineering? So how did you go about packaging that and convincing a company like Replit to take a chance?
Yeah, I spent a while trying to think about my resume, so my freelancing work and the development work that I had done at Columbia, and packaging it up. So I spent a while building my website while I was applying for jobs to try and beef up my skills and make the things that I had done more visible that don't pop out on the resume. I think that helped. I think the conversations and the interviews, it also came out in those with the hiring manager and folks at Replit that I was talking to. And there were people at Replit who had transitioned from teacher to working at Replit. So there was another resonance there for some of the people I spoke to.
How important was networking in all of this, in all of your transitions and your explorations? How did that influence what you did?
The transition to Replit was probably the only one where networking didn't play into it, but every other transition, it was a major piece that I had some foot in the door by knowing somebody or having some common thing in that we had to talk about. Like my student hiring me because he was my student, or the people at Columbia hiring me because I had worked with them part-time before. My network was probably the reason most of these transitions happened.
Mm-hmm. Now about the more, what I would call more cold networking you did, just, exploring different avenues, different possibilities out there. How did that help? How did that influence anything for you?
I think the conversations, which was something you had coached me to do, to have conversations with people and just ask them for advice around your future. So when I was thinking about leaving academia and trying to figure out where I could go, had a bunch of conversations that weren't networking to try and find a job, but were networking to try and learn about a new space, and try and figure out if I want to be in that space. That those were very formative for me for eventually crystallizing on, yes, I want to go into a startup. I want to work on education in the context of that startup.
Mm-hmm.
John, can I ask?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Mike, when you make every time you talked about a transition or a journey, I'm thinking about how much a master's degree cost me, how much a PhD would have cost me if I had gone down the road like you were going to. And as an HR person, I'm also factoring in each salary of each thing you're talking about, because my brother's also a teacher. So how much, or if at all, did you have to factor in the financial ups and downs of each transition? Or was that not at all? Was it more about what you're interested in? Or did you at any point have to factor in, oh, I have to make the certain amount, so when I transition, I got to make sure it's like this, you know what I mean? Salary range versus, or was that just not even a thing?
Oh, that's
the reality aspect.
yeah. I think the more recent transitions were that factored in. It's like, oh, I've got student loan from this choice I made to go pursue art. So I can't go couch surf like my advisor is telling me to. I have to go get a job that would realistically eventually pay off my debt. And same for leaving Columbia. Like, there was a balance that I did in my head of like, yes, I'm going to give up some of my agency. Maybe some of the work won't be as rewarding, but it will be a stable job that will allow me to pay off my debt, and still be somewhat rewarding. So yeah, it was realistically a part of that decision making.
So now, many people think of neuroscience and the arts as, opposite sides of the brain, and have a hard time imagining how someone taps into both of those. How have you found that tapping into both sides has shaped you, shaped your career, shaped your interests?
Yeah, the role that I ended up at Replit doing involves a lot of agency and making decisions about the product as an engineer. So I think it ends up being the confluence a lot of the skills that I picked up, where I get to be the programmer, scientist, and solve a very defined problem that's been given to me. But also I get to do more of the creative art side of things, where I can think about our product as a whole and try and think about, well, what would an ideal user need? Like, what is the thing that we don't have that we could go build, and then go execute on those things.
Mhm. And do you feel like that initial exploration that, both through college and graduate school and in neuroscience, was it worth it? Did it, does that still provide you a benefit?
I think so. It's hard for me to imagine landing at the same place if I hadn't gone through this very winding journey to get where I am. The neuroscience training helped me be very principled and methodical when approaching a problem, and I carry that through to everything that I'm working on. But then, the art allows me to be a little bit broader in my approach and think a little bit more outside the box. So I think it was important. It would be a bummer to learn out that it didn't actually matter and that I could have ended up here without having gone through all of those different transitions.
Well, I think you would be a very different software engineer if you hadn't done all those other things. So looking back, what would you say are some of the aha moments you've had in your windy, but actually relatively short career so far? At least as far as most of us on the call are concerned.
I think a lot of the transitions were prompted by an aha moment of realizing that the current path that I was on wasn't going to be satisfying long term. So trying to listen to those and try and reflect on whether I'm enjoying the day-to-day that I'm working on has been important. I think some of the other aha moments probably came from just connecting with people and learning about different fields or areas and domains that I had no idea about prior. Like in grad school, not knowing that you could even make art without paint. I was very naive at the time, but just learning about that helped open up career paths.
Mm-hmm. So Millie asked, what has helped you to take career risks?
I think one of the ways that I tried to de-risk some of the transitions was that they overlapped a little bit. Like while I was in grad school for neuroscience, in my free time, I was taking art classes and playing with making art on the side. So it gave me a taste for that next thing, helped build my resume a little bit too, to make the next transition easier. And I think probably each of the transitions, there was some amount of that happening behind the scenes, that it wasn't just an immediate transition. It was a thing that I had been working on for 6 months, a year, and then made it happen.
Mm-hmm. So, so what advice, would you have for others who are considering making a transition, making a career shift?
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, everyone has different contexts for where they are and different shifts that are easier or harder to make. I think connecting with people and talking to learn about whatever shift you're trying to make, that whatever the industry is or the job or the domain that you're trying to shift into, is a good first step to give you experience. and then look for other ways that you can open the door into that space, through your network, through part-time roles, through whatever it is. And I guess the other thing that I think about with those is that life is short. So if you're in a spot where you're not really enjoying what you're doing, taking that, reflecting on that, and then taking that as a push to make a transition and to try and make small moves to take you in the new direction. That's been pretty important to me.
Yeah, I think many of us get to a place where we may know intellectually we're in the wrong place, but it's hard to make that change. Yeah, it's almost sometimes one of the best things that can happen to you is when the startup folds or your company goes through a reorg, because it kind of gives you the kick in the butt to force you to reevaluate and make the change that maybe you've known you should make for a long time. So Uma asked, how did you handle moments of self-doubt and your inner critic?
Yeah, well, those came up a lot in art school, coming from a different background where I felt like an imposter. But then I eventually learned that a lot of my friends in the program who came from art backgrounds also felt like imposters when they were faced with new projects or big challenges. So at a certain point, I think I internalized that, like, I will have doubt, I will not know what I'm doing, but I have a process that will get me closer to knowing what I'm doing. So if I'm faced with a new challenge at work and I'm doubting whether I can do it, I will just try and take it one piece at a time and trust that I know in the past I've been able to overcome things, and that in the future I'll hopefully overcome them. Still deal with it and have those moments of doubt.
And Piyush asks, how did you go about seeking advice and mentorship from ex-seniors who you would have worked with in the past?
Yeah, I think my mentors in undergrad, I was still connected with them, so it was a very easy relationship to then just ask them for advice. But some of the people that I've worked with, I just cold reached out to them. It'd been a year since I had talked to them. I just sent them an email to ask how they're doing, see if they'd be willing to hop on a call or grab coffee, that I wanted to pick their brain about, whatever it was.
Okay, and one last question, because we're almost at time. Looking back, is there anything that you would want to have done differently?
Hard for me to imagine making any of those big shifts differently, and landing up in the same place. I like where I landed up. I would love to have not needed to go to grad school and go into debt to learn some of those lessons. I feel like there might have been ways to do it without having to go to grad school for art. So if I could have connected with communities that were making art and just kept doing it on the side and made my own transition when I wanted to make my transition, that might have been a good thing to change.
Great. Well, thanks, Michael, for doing this. This was a great conversation. I encourage everyone to connect with Michael on LinkedIn. I think I provided a link, I believe, in the emails, but I'll send it again later on with the link to the recording that I've done. So anyone who wants to watch some of this again or miss some of it. Kathleen, did you want to?
Can I just make a quick comment? I don't really have a question. But Mike, thank you. Thank you for the time and your career journey. Certainly has been interesting. I just want to mention, I want to thank you also. I've recently started to work on a career transition situation, and I was struggling actually to come up with projects of mine that I could tell stories about. And you're speaking, and you being in Chicago and going to art school and everything triggered my remembrance of about 10 years ago, in collaboration with the MacArthur Foundation and the Carnegie Mellon Entertainment Technology School, I designed a game for the city of Chicago called Burnham's Got Game, so to teach school children about the Burnham Master Plan and the development of that began in downtown Chicago and obviously radiated out. So that was a lot of fun. I love games. I love designing games. And now I have a whole direction to go in with this. So I just think it's marvelous. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, thanks all for coming. And watch for, I do these every 6 weeks or so. So if if you know someone who you think would be interesting to be interviewed, or if any of you have had interesting career transitions that you think would be interesting for the series, let me know, because I'm always looking for new people to interview. And I also have on Tuesday another free webinar, 5 Secrets to Landing a 6-Figure Job. So if you know anyone who might benefit from that, tell them about it. You can, if you go to the homepage of my website, there's a link right there to give all the details and to sign up for it. So thanks everyone for coming, and thanks so much, Michael, for agreeing to do this. It was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you all.